There's a lot of reasons that a plant might not turn purple. And the main one being the genetics. The genetics is going to play a major role in both the color it naturally turns and its propensity to turn purple under certain environmental characteristics. You can get a lot of different expressions of what a certain cultivar looks like depending on the environmental characteristics. If you have a strain that doesn't naturally want to turn purple, and that's what you need to do for your market, then you're going to have to do things that that strain doesn't really like. And that could be subjecting it to really low temperatures, really low root zone temperatures through cooling your or chilling your irrigation water. And it can also be done through things like manipulating the lights and the spectrum that the plants are exposed to for the last couple of weeks of flower. Shifting that spectrum might be one of like the least problematic strategies that can be done here. This happens a lot in red leaf lettuce and cabbage as well, where cultivators will shift to more blue spectrum for the last couple of weeks of their ripening cycle to help bring out the anthocyanin content. But if you're in that situation where you just have no option other than to turn your flower purple or have it not sell, then you have to do things. You do what I call throwing the kitchen sink at it. You do everything at once. You're going to drop your temperatures. You're going to drop your feed and irrigation temperatures. You're going to manipulate the spectral distribution of your lights if you can. You're going to try to taper off nitrogen in the fertilizer. And we have a bunch of different recipes. One of those is our ripen recipe, which purposefully tapers off the relative contribution of nitrogen in that recipe so that we can get the plant to consume its nitrogen stores and shift more of its focus to secondary metabolism. The important thing to know is a lot of these things are actually going to slow down photosynthesis to some degree, especially things like cooling down root zone or leaf temperatures too much. So you might be actually missing out on small amounts of yield potential and potency just because you're slowing down photosynthesis, which is reducing the total amount of plant available energy. And that energy is what the plant's going to be using either to bulk the flower, to produce secondary metabolites like THC, other cannabinoids, and terpenes. So there's always going to be trade-offs, but that is the nature of cultivation, is looking at trade-offs and choosing the one that creates the most positive net effect for your operation. The best place to go right here would just be to segue into talking really briefly about hydronic heating of root zones in greenhouses. In the winter, one of the benefits that a lot of cultivators are going to see, especially if they're in a controlled greenhouse environment or something like that, is that the plants are going to turn a lot more purple. You have that option by using some of the cooler ambient temperatures to influence the internal temperatures of the greenhouse and the root zone. The flip side of that, like we were talking about, is the trade-off of root zone temperatures. And root zone temperatures are one of the most important and underrated factors for enhancing photosynthesis in yield in greenhouse and outdoor environments. So if your root zone drops too cool, plants will just stop photosynthesizing completely, which means they're no longer absorbing CO2, they're no longer producing assimilates and then using that for growth and development and ripening. So one of the pieces of technology that becomes incredibly useful in this sort of context is hydronic root zone heating, which can be a lot more efficient and targeted than trying to heat an entire greenhouse airspace. If you're able to just heat up the root zone enough to keep photosynthesis going, you can use a fraction of the total amount of energy that it would take otherwise, but still produce really high quality yields in the winters.
Operations, like in the Midwest, I was actually at a facility in Illinois this week, and it gets really cold in the Midwest, and it gets cold pretty early, and they just went through a crazy cold snap. It's a startup. They're starting to dial things in, so commissioning of the building is still going on, and an oversight that happened was they had a water heating loop in their water storage system, and it had never been turned on. And they started operating back in like April or May, and they had the luxury of having pretty warm groundwater temperatures coming into their system. They had a building that was easy to keep their water room at 70 degrees, 72 degrees. So with the warmer water temps and a controlled environment inside the facility, they weren't having really an issue with water temperature. It was coming out between 68 and 72 degrees every day. And that was based on the starting water temperature being in that higher 60s window, and then allowing the bulk storage tanks to sit in a tempered room. And overnight, once they replenished the tanks and they had 10, 12 hours to sit in that temperature, just naturally being able to bring up that water temperature to that ideal range without even really thinking about it. But they went through this cold snap, and groundwater temps dropped over a few days, like 8-9 degrees. And all of a sudden, they started seeing 61, 62 degree water temps, and just didn't realize, I guess, they assumed that everything was working. And I went back there and I'm looking at this Aqualogic inline water heater, and it's just off. And I'm like, hey, you got this heater, it's not on. Here's your problem. It's here for a reason. Let's get this thing fired up. And their bulk storage was, I think, around 12,000 gallons of water. So it took a little time, but after a day or two, getting that water temperature up to that ideal range, immediately they're checking their meters, they're testing their runoff, and they're seeing ideal root zone temperatures and water temperatures with their feeds, back to that luxury range that we're looking for nutrient availability and optimal metabolism, right? So understanding of the seasonal changes and how your groundwater temp changes, and making sure you have the systems in place to maintain that water temperature is super critical, and it's easily forgotten about. I mean, not in a mature operation, but especially these startups and buildings that are just now starting to run for the first time and go through these seasonal changes. It's just critical to make sure the equipment's firing, and that you have a dedicated team ensuring that the equipment's working and functioning as it's supposed to be. Along with that too, though, you have like different room designs, and the first runs coming into the flower rooms, and they're trying to dial in the environment. They're looking at the supply air on one side of the room, the return air on the other side of the room, and your supply on the supply air side. You walk into the room and it's just cold. Like immediately, the first thing you notice is, man, it is cold. You're feeling that cold supply air coming out of the ducts. And I'm like, what's going on here? Why is it so cold? And it's like, well, the back of the room is super hot. So they're trying to compensate by setting the cooling set point lower to keep the back of the room from heating up. And this was addressed and adjusted based on, well, you have somewhat inexperienced people that haven't done this before trying to just manipulate the system, but what they're not realizing is they're setting the set point so low in a room that is on with all of these lights. It's never satisfying that cooling set point, so it's constantly just dumping 55 degree air conditioned supply air, and the front of the room is just always cold. Yeah, you're getting that 78 degrees at the back of the room, but by adjusting your supply and return fan speed to get them balanced appropriately, and then actually setting a realistic set point for your air conditioning system, we were able to balance the rooms and allow the mechanical system to operate within its luxury range and supply that cool air when it needs to keep up with it, but then move that air through the room with a system of fans and the proper return airspeed to get it equalized and not so cold at one end and hot at the other. And I think that's just like the growing pain with these controlled environment buildings and being a brand new facility, turning it on for the first time and having to go through the headache of like, talk to your controls contractor, talk to your mechanical contractor, get them to log in to the system and make these adjustments. And then you have to just let it ride and watch it for hours, and really get some secondary sensors deployed in certain areas and corners of the room so you can get the data you need holistically and not just in the 2 or 3 sensors that they have. And then there's certain things you just have to deal with where it's like, hey, maybe based on the design and lack of strategically placed air supply registers, you're just going to have to live with maybe the first 10, 15 feet of that room from the supply air side being a little bit colder than the rest of the room. But over time and money spent, you might be able to adjust that and make that a better situation. But you got to accept the design you're working with, the systems you have, and just be realistically about what you can and cannot do.
Yeah, this really gets at why environmental uniformity is such a critical piece of grow room design and operation. You've got plants in different areas of the room that might be transpiring and photosynthesizing at different rates when you've got these little microclimates. So if that's the case and transpiration is way up in one area of the room because it's much warmer or drier, or warmer and drier than another part, they're going to be pulling a lot more water up through the plant over there, water and nutrients together. So the amount of delivery is going to be much higher relative to the lighting level. In another section of the room where it's cooler or much more humid, then the opposite's going to be happening. The plant may not be pulling much water and nutrients up at all. So the relative delivery compared to the lighting level could be quite low. And this really becomes a problem when we look at it in terms of photosynthesis, because what we want is for water and nutrients to be delivered in proportion to how quickly the plant is photosynthesizing. So for every CO2 molecule that gets pulled in and goes through that process, certain amount of water and minerals is going to be required. And the rate of photosynthesis is going to be largely set by the ppfd, by the light intensity. So if the photosynthesis is going to be really, really high, but transpiration is low, then that area of the room just might not be getting enough water and nutrients. And vice versa. If the photosynthesis is really high in another part of the room, but transpiration is super high and water and nutrients are getting pulled through the plants at a much higher rate, then you run the risk of over fertilizing in that context. So it becomes really tricky trying to match the total amount of fertilizer and the feed EC with the room demands when there's these microclimates. It just becomes impossible to give the plants exactly what they need at a given time, because certain areas of the room might be requiring much more nutrients and other areas might be requiring much less. So the more we can use those HAF fans and other tools like that, hopefully you have air coming in at different points of the room and not all dumping in on one end where it's cold. The more we can use tools like that to keep those conditions uniform, the better the plants are going to perform in proportion to the fertilizer that's coming in and the overall strategy of the irrigation.